So let's talk about some big and chunky armoured elites in tactical dreadnought armour, with a review and rating for every single Terminator Squad in Warhammer 40K. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today I thought we'd return to take another look at a bunch of Terminators, particularly in the wake of a whole bunch of Chaos Codexes coming out and changing a bunch of their units in a fairly big way. Terminators are certainly one of the iconic things of Warhammer 40k, big and powerful space marines clad in tactical dreadnought armour, basically a walking tank pretty much, with their exo armour so heavy it needs additional power to make it move. Some of the finest armours made by great artificers of the Imperium or foul warpsmiths of Chaos, allowing the bearer to handle some heavy weapon systems with ease, some also building in some force field technology. They tend to be pretty iconic units for the Space Marines and Chaos Space Marines that can field them, big focal points for the Chapter or Legion, and in game they often tend to have a whole bunch of offense and defense on an individual basis, though big chunky stats are often charged at a high points cost as a result. In any case though, for this one let's talk through each Warhammer 40k Terminator squad, focusing on the actual units as opposed to the characters, what the unit can do in game for its faction, and a very rough power rating out of 10 for how I'd rate them right now. First up, let's start with the standard issue Adeptus Astartes and the Terminator Squad for the Space Marines. They had their rather good looking and nicely received new miniatures at the start of 10th edition, still keeping the iconic profile but a bit chunkier, upscaled and maybe slightly better proportioned, in the lore generally fielded in the chapter's first company, with these relic suits only being entrusted to veterans. In game, a standard Terminator stat line has 3 wounds at toughness 5 with a 2+ save and a 4+ invulnerable. Really quite indomitable and hard to kill, and particularly so with things like Armour of Contempt or equivalents out there. They move a little slowly at 5-inch movement, though can get to the fight with Deep Strike, maybe making them an interesting enough choice for rapid ingress, turning up in the enemy turn, then moving up to make an easy charge in yours. The regular Space Marine Terminators are armed with Stormbolter and Power Fist, so a flurry of small arms at close range, and then a bunch of Strength 8 and Damage 2 attacks in melee. You can take those on all models, or swap them out for the Chain Fist, which is worse against most things besides vehicles, where it gains Anti-Vehicle 3+, so really quite big for bringing down big tough things like, say, Knights. One of the models gets a heavy weapon, maybe an assault cannon or perhaps a cyclone missile launcher being the most popular. I think I'd be most tempted by the cyclones, and for their special rule they get Fury of the First. If they target the Oath of Moment targets, they get a +1 to the hit roll, so pretty brutal against that target in Core Codex Space Marines, potentially re-rolling hits with a +1 to hit, and then +1 to wound, making all of those hits hit home. You also get a fun teleport homer rule as well, potentially allowing a free rapid ingress, though it does kind of depend on your opponent lining things up for you nicely. In general, standard Terminator stat line has often struggled throughout 40k's history. It's usually expected that their durability is quite good, and being able to get there with Deep Strike and also having some firepower often means their points cost is quite high, and their melee damage output just isn't particularly standout as a result, at least not compared with competitors. At the moment they feel like a unit that's certainly not unusable in casual games. It's kind of easy to use as they're tougher than most Space Marines out there, but you very rarely ever see them in competitive games unfortunately. Even in chapters that could significantly buff their damage output, such as the Blood Angels, they could be hitting at strength 10 with 4 attacks on the charge each there, but just get outcompeted by other options. Overall, I've given them a 6 out of 10 for power. I still think that they're a unit that could probably do with either a rules boost or a points drop. Next up, we've got the Terminator Assault Squad, which for the Space Marines are probably rated the slightly stronger one out of their generic Terminator variants. Their models do feel like they're in need of an update though, and it will be cool to see them matching the same sort of size and scale as the regular Terminators now. I'm sure it will happen sooner or later. They either get Lightning Claws or Thunderhammer and Power Fist, people generally taking the Thunderhammer and Power Fist in 10th edition. They're maybe not super well balanced. The Thunderhammers hitting with their devastating wounds, they're not quite as accurately as the regular Terminators, but if you take that load out and they're 4 wounds apiece, so are legitimately really quite tough for the cost, even if they are a little bit more expensive per model. They also get the Teleport Homer and Deep Strike, again could be delivered by rapid ingress, and they force some battle shock tests in close combat as well, which could occasionally be handy enough, maybe preventing a defensive stratagem or something. They maybe feel like an interesting unit for putting any really big damage or defensive enhancements in. Perhaps in particular the 10 Houses Bones of the Black Templars is particularly good for them, a 5+ feel no pain on top of that, very big defensive stat line. And they're also quite nice for being able to flex into an anti-psyker keyword with their vows. 1 command points to make anti-psyker on all those Thunderhammers with devastating wounds is really quite a big combo that could be laying low some Demon Primarchs. Overall, I've given them a 6.5 out of 10. Still rather overshadowed for Core Codex Space Marines. You very rarely see them in competitive tournament lists. I would rate them a bit higher for the Black Templars though. Next up, we've got the Terminator squads of the Knights of Titan, the elite and well-supplied chapter having enough armour that they can deploy much of the chapter in the suits, no expense spared where it comes to stealing demon incursions. They'll beam down to take out key individuals, slay great demons and close warp rifts with some of the finest war gear that humanity can bring to bear. In game they have a fairly standard stat line to the Space Marine Terminators. They get OC2 and a battle line, so a bit more weight on objectives there, and they also get a banner in the unit, making them all the way up to OC3, so certainly more weight on mid-board objectives. Their standard melee profile has 4 attacks at strength 6, AP 2 and damage 2, and they get lethal hits on the charge. Between that it makes them one of the Grey Knight's stronger units at taking down tough stuff. Also have a flurry of Stormbolter fire, plus maybe a Psy Cannon or Incinerator to back it up. They also get the rather nice advantage of having a Narthesium in the unit as well, so if you leave the squad half killed, then a model gets 2 returned to the board. Really quite good for a fairly tough unit like them, where there's a pretty reasonable chance of that happening. I'd probably rate these guys as strongest when accompanied by Caldor Drago. He allows them to drop down and then make a fairly easy charge from Deep Strike, potentially command point re-rolling as well, and that means they're very likely to get the charge with those lethal hits, and he adds in a bunch of higher AP damage 3 attacks, which is quite nice to balance out the squad's threat against tougher things. Overall I'd rate them as a pretty solid unit for the Grey Knights. I've given them a 7.5 out of 10 here. For their counterparts, we've got the Paladin squad. They tend to be lesser played versus the Brotherhood Terminators, though maybe aren't crazy far behind. They basically get a whole bunch of trade-offs, both on the damage and defense. They don't revive models, but they get a -1 to wound. They don't get lethal hits, but their base attacks hit on a 2+, including their ranged things, and they get more special weapons. Overall, between all that, they feel like a solid enough side grade versus the regular Terminator units. Personally, I feel like those trade-offs bring them out as more or less even compared with the regular ones. I think the main issue is their points. I feel like at 215 points, you're just paying an extra 15 points for not really all that much gain. I can see why the more regular squad is preferred. I've given these guys a 6.5 out of 10. I just haven't seen too many people using them in competitive Grey Knight lists for quite a long time at this point. Before we move on to the other flavours of Terminators out there, I'll just give a quick shout out to today's video sponsor in ObjectiveMarkers.com. And they're one option to get some themed faction-specific points to fight over for Warhammer 40K. They're based in the UK and shipped to the UK and the USA now, and they're linked down in the video description. These fancy objective markers are the main things that they offer. Pretty useful things to have when setting up a gaming board for Warhammer 40K. Fairly common out there on the tournament scene. They're basically pre-measured objectives made out of flexible silicon. You have the central 40mm objective marker displayed, and then a 3-inch radius around that all marked out already, so it's super simple to see what units are on objectives or what aren't. Their particular version have some fun faction themed things on them, but are also clear so as not to detract too much from the surface of the battlefield that you're playing on. They've got a whole bunch of specific examples that could be good for various 40k armies. For example, the Space Warriors could be nice for your power armoured Terminators and things. And then a whole bunch of different designs on top of that, ones that could be good for all manner of Xenos armies or Chaos Forces out there. They could also be nice enough as gifts or prizes maybe. Currently, to celebrate their launch, they're also shipping a whole bunch of dice with each marker at no extra cost, available while stocks last. And they do have some other things on their site as well, such as some clearly defined ruined terrain footprints. In any case, feel free to check them out, there'll be links down in the video description, and a big thank you to them for sponsoring this one. Back to the Terminator formations though, and next up we have the Allied Custodians of the Adeptus Custodes. They're 60 points each, and as with Custodes relative to regular Space Marines, standing above the vast majority of other Terminators out there. You can field them in squads of between 2 and 6. A big 4 wounds at toughness 7 with the 2+ save and the 4+ invulnerable. And compared with other Custodes, they're perhaps surprisingly shooty against light things, having a bunch of stats blast shots with the ballistas grenade launchers plus the Guardian Spear shooting. And when that's all hitting on a 2+, it can cut through hordes at least fairly quickly. In melee, they typically tend to get armed with Guardian Spears, hitting with a standard Custodian profile, 5 attacks at strength 7, AP 2 and damage 2, amped up by Martial Qatar, and then they have 2 pretty excellent special rules. They get to reroll wound rolls against characters, monsters or vehicles, so extra good versus those datasheets compared with most, and that works at range as well. And then a pretty powerful from Golden Light, allowing the squad to return to reserve if it's out of position or just in the backfield, and warp to the front of the enemy army in your next reinforcement phase. Potentially doing a bunch of shooting, being good for doing secondary objectives, or maybe getting long charges against choice targets. They can potentially do that turn 1 as well if they return to reserve during the enemy turn 1 if they go first. It can be particularly interesting in the lines of the Emperor detachment. Getting +1 to wound and re-rolling all wound rolls is absolutely murderous, and they could also do that split the squad into multiple small units, all of which could go about deep striking and potentially be really quite cheap and expendable Custodes units for secondaries and skirmishing. Not something that they can normally do. Overall, certainly a solidly powerful unit for the Custodes, maybe a bit better in lines versus elsewhere. I've given them an 8 out of 10 here. For the other Terminator datasheet, there's the Aquilon Terminators, who are maybe still in a bit of an unfortunate spot and not particularly well balanced as a Forge World datasheet, basically just being like the Allied Terminators but pretty directly worse. They do have some fairly cool looking arms and armour though. They get the choice of a clutch of different fancy shooting profiles, though given that the Alarists get 2 shooting profiles, they don't really come out ahead in my opinion. They get a +1 strength over the Guardian Spear with their power gauntlets, the same Golden Light special rule, and then in my opinion a worse damage buff, rerolling wound rolls of 1 against the closest enemy, as opposed to all wound rolls against choice targets. On top of that, as well as arguably having a worse data sheet outright, they're also more expensive, 15 points more per unit of 3. And between all that, they're just generally not seen on the tabletop in competitive lists. Overall, I've given them a 4.5 out of 10. Again, maybe not outright unusable, but just very definitely outright worse. Next up, we've got the big indomitable and scary Deathwing Knights of the Dark Angels. Dark Angels being well regarded for their Terminator formations, fighting in their bone-coloured armour, and often being the hammer that's called in to break the fallen after they've been located by the Raven Wing. Their Deathwing Knight Terminator models were particularly well received, having a bit of a different aesthetic to the normal Indomitus Terminator armour, and coming with a choice of power weapons versus maces. They cost a lot more than regular Terminators, 250 points per 5, making them the most expensive variant that isn't Custodes, and for that they have a 4 wound stat line thanks to their storm shields, getting -1 damage, so damage 2 attacks are going to be really ineffective against them, and you need a flat damage 5 to outright destroy one of them, backed up by the Watcher in the Dark that can give them a 4+ feel no pain against mortal wounds once per battle. They can use Armour of Contempt like other Space Marines, and they might get on very nicely with the Wrath of the Rock detachment for a -1 to wound on top of all of that. When they get into melee, they hit really hard, often taking Maces of Absolution for 4 attacks, hitting on a 2, at Strength 6, AP 2 and Damage 2, wounding all vehicles and monsters on a 4+, and then backed up by a great weapon, with devastating wounds and sustained hits. Between all that, they've got enough durability to survive in the midfield, and enough damage to destroy things that they can catch. They get on well with just about every army that the Unforgiven can field. Plenty of good stuff in the Wrath of the Rock as mentioned, and they also really like the detachments that can allow advance and charge as well, so they can actually get into things a bit better. Things like the Stormlands or the Gladius. Overall, I certainly rate them as a strong unit. I've given them an 8.5 out of 10 here. For the more regular Deathwing Terminator Squad though, I feel like things just aren't quite so good. They have a datasheet that's only really subtly different to the standard Space Marine Terminator unit, which maybe isn't a good start, seeing as that one's rather overshadowed, but just paid more points for some slightly mild gains. They have a Watcher in the Dark that can be a ward against some mortal wounds. Their Fury of the First gets enhanced to the Deathwing rule, which allows them to ignore modifiers to hit or weapon skill. And they have the option for a plasma cannon for a heavy weapon, which while being really fun and themed and everything, isn't really all that strong compared with the competition. It's not awful, but I feel like having the chance of just one-shotting your own Terminator is enough to put it behind the Cyclone missile launcher. Overall, they just feel like they're on a par with the more regular Space Marine Terminators. Not unusable, but overshadowed by other units in the Space Marine Codex, and particularly by the Deathwing Knights for Dark Angels. I've chosen to give them a 6 out of 10. For the Deathwatch, their Terminator squads come at 190 points per 5 of them, were briefly taken away during 10th edition, though came back with a similar datasheet to what they had before. A slightly surprisingly flexible wargear loadout for 10th edition at least. It means the squad can take a trio of Cyclone missile launchers in the unit, which is some surprisingly heavy firepower for a Terminator squad, and in particular can be amped up in Deathwatch with their mission tactics and their special issue ammunition, as they do have the kill team keyword. The other Terminators could also be taking things like Thunderhammers and Storm Shields, so making the unit a bit tougher as well, and they still pack a punch in melee with their mass power fist profiles. Overall, a pretty scary and useful unit, and they could take advantage of some of the other Deathwatch stratagems, like returning to reserves with their Teleportarium, or maybe having some extra big hitting focus fire with extra Oath of Moment copies from the Tome of Ectoclades. Overall, very solid for the Deathwatch. I've given them an 8 out of 10. Next up for the Sons of Fenris, we've got the Space Wolves Wolfguard Terminators. There are 170 points per 5 of them, and just recently have had their new fancy models released, looking rather good in the upscaled Terminator armour, plus having a rather impressive array of fancy beards and facial hair on the go. Their base profile has a bit of a side grade on the regular Terminator squad, interestingly enough with the option to take Storm Shield and Power Weapon. So the regular guys have 4 attacks at Strength 5, AP -2 and Damage 2, and then usually taking a Storm Shield for an extra wound on top of that. One guy gets a Power Fist and an Assault Cannon, which I think is worth taking for the extra firepower, and then the pack leader can take a Great Weapon with 3 attacks at Strength 7, AP 2, Damage 3 and Devastating Wounds. Finally, on the defensive side of things, they've also got Rugged Resilience, a -1 to wound for things that are stronger than you are tough, so the majority of things that are really going to threaten Terminators. Overall, between all that, they feel like a pretty solid general purpose Terminator unit, just really quite a lot more efficient than the standard Space Marine Terminator squads, and costing just the 10 points more. Fairly equally threatening profiles with significant more defense with the Storm Shields and the -1 to wound. Feels like a fairly big win overall. They could have some interesting combos with the Space Wolves, maybe dropping in turn 1 with Logan Grimnar potentially. Overall, I've chosen to give them a 7.5 out of 10. Will be interesting to see how often they crop up in competitive lists once they hit the tournament scene. Finally, for the Imperium, we've got Grey Knights Take 2, and the Imperial agents have a copy of the Grey Knight Terminator Squad as well. This one more representing them being fielded as an allied asset from the Ordo Malleus, if there does happen to be some demonic threat for them to stamp down on. They can either be fielded in core Imperial agents for 190 points, or 210 points for an allied unit, paying a premium there. For their raw stats, they basically have the exact same profile as the Grey Knight Terminator Squad, so some fairly general purpose force weapons with the lethal hits on the charge, the Narthesium to revive models, and the Ancient Banner for extra OC. They don't really have quite the same sort of detachment support compared with the Grey Knights. They don't get the same sort of teleport shenanigans or quite as many tailored strats, and particularly not when they're fielded as allies, where they're just quite inefficient as fielded that way, as they're paying more points than the Grey Knight Terminator Squad for a squad that's got way less support. Could still be a fun thing to throw into an Imperial army though, but would rate it more for fun factor than really adding strength. They never really seem to get played that way in competitive games. For the agents themselves, they still don't really generally tend to get played very much. If you want big hitting damage dealers for the agents, then it generally tends to be the Deathwatch that get the nod as opposed to these guys. They're just a bit more threat overall for the points cost, particularly with their heavy thunderhammers and close range shooting, and a bit more support on offer with the Deathwatch characters that could join them. Overall, I've given them a 5 out of 10 here, basically like the Grey Knight Terminators but downgraded a bit, worse support and no character options, and the higher points cost for allies. Onto the Forces of Chaos next, and first up we have the standard Chaos Space Marines, the Fallen Terminators with a whole bunch of spikes and trophy racks on them, Abaddon's own Black Legion being particularly well known for fielding formations of them. They're 180 points per 5, get the same base profile as the Loyalists, though Games Workshop made their war gear a little bit on the annoying side to select, trying to really follow the options that are in the kit, and it means that you have a slightly eclectic mix of things, but ultimately a bunch of power fists in the unit, often one taking paired accursed weapons for some rerolls, and one with a heavy weapon in the squad once more. Chaos Marines get a nice boost to damage output with their Dark Pacts, getting sustained hits or lethal hits against whatever they need to, so hit a bunch harder than most Terminators out there, and the Chaos Terminators amp that up further, re-rolling the hit roll as well if they make a Dark Pact, so compared with most they certainly hit hard. For support options and characters, there may be a little bit more on the mid-side in my opinion. Maybe the Terminator Sorcerer for the AP debuffs could be nice enough. Abaddon's maybe a bit better off leading Chosen, as there's a bit of annoying anti-synergy with his own hit rerolls basically being the same as the datasheet rule here, which means that either one or the other is basically wasted. I've seen occasional people using them in competitive lists, but in general they tend to get outcompeted by some combination of Chosen, Legionaries or Possessed. I still feel like they're usable enough. I've given them a 7 out of 10. I don't know if maybe that's a tiny bit on the generous side, but could be an interesting enough unit to drop in, maybe using Rapid Ingress. They can get some good value out of a number of detachments, lots of good stat line and melee things from the creations of Bile, and things like AP buffs and Advance and Charge from Renegade Raiders. Next up, we've got the World Eaters Terminator Squad. They use the same base models as the Chaos Terminators. They pay 185 points per 5 of them, and basically get the same sort of war gear, but in general they'll move a bit faster with a 7-inch base move here, and rather than gaining Dark Packs they might gain additional damage benefits from the Blessings of Khorne, and potentially the charge buff ones from the Berserker Warband if you're playing that one, getting +2 strength and +1 attack on the charge. Between all that, they can still hit really quite adequately hard, and then compared with most World Eaters units, they're maybe a little bit more on the durable side. They can shoot a bit harder than some Terminators out there, re-rolling hit rolls when shooting the closest enemy unit, and then re-rolling charge rolls against the same. Overall, between all that, they have tended to be quite niche for the World Eaters so far though. Some people have had success with them, though it is pretty rare to see them in competitive lists. It just feels like there's multiple melee options that are just overall better, calm with Berserkers in a Rhino, smaller or larger squads of 8 bound, and also competing against the shooting damage dealers like the Forge Fiend as well. Between all that, I feel like they're not unusable but a bit overshadowed. I've given them a 6 out of 10 here. For the Emperor's Children Terminators, it maybe feels the same if not more so. Again, using the standard Chaos Space Marine models, it would be really nice to see some actual sculpted Terminators for the Emperor's Children and the World Eaters, something maybe akin to what they get in Heresy. The Emperor's Children at base get a 6-inch movement, and they get Thrill Seekers. They can advance shoot and charge and fall back shoot and charge, within some limitations about not doubling up on things or charging back into the same thing. It could mean that they're a bit better at keeping themselves relevant once they're on the board. I'd say their datasheet rule isn't the strongest though. If they shoot everything against one target, they get to reroll charge rolls against the same unit. Not absolutely awful, though you could command point reroll it for 1 CP, and if they're dropping in at 9 inches and trying to make a long charge via deep strike, they're still odds on not to get in and just sit out in the open. Overall, it just feels like all the other mainline damage dealers for the Emperor's Children are more interesting than them right now. They tend to get outcompeted between things like Noise Marines, Winged Demon Princes, Infractors with a Lord Exultant, and maybe Morlophines. Overall, I've given them a 5 out of 10. I feel like they could probably do with a points cut or a more useful datasheet rule. Next up for the Thousand Suns, we've got their Dusty Rubrique Scarab Occult Terminators, a squad of Ensorcered Automata elites led by a Scarab Occult Sorcerer. They're 180 for the small squad of 5, or 375 points for the big investment squad of 10. I'd say they're a unit that's just far stronger in the Rubrique phalanx versus elsewhere, where they've got a whole bunch of dedicated support. On the defensive, they have their standard Terminator stat line, a Scarab Sorcerer getting 1 extra wound, and they get just a flat -1 to wound when they're attacked by anything while they're still a Psyker, including the squad leader inside the squad. A slightly unusual one as it also affects small arms, which are just going to be extra ineffective against them. For their damage output, they've got quite a bit of punchy stuff at range, AP -2 with their combi bolters, plus some very punchy Soul Reaper cannons and some Hellfire missiles. They can shoot pretty devastatingly hard, particularly when they're amped up by the Thousand Suns shooting buffs. The Kabbalistic rituals focused on one unit can be massive for them, and they've got enough volume attacks in melee to be able to take out most normal size units, particularly if they're also joined by a mainline Sorcerer and Terminator armor, which I think is well worth for the unit with the lethal hits and its own psychic damage added in. In the Rubrique phalanx, he's particularly nice for the Lord of the Rubrique enhancement, giving them all a +1 to hit as well. And while it might cost a massive almost 500 points, that is a big indomitable unit that's going to drop down, absolutely obliterate virtually any one threat, and then be very hard to kill in return, particularly with stratagem support. Overall, it seems like the general take of them, the Thousand Suns, is that they're a bit on the costly side for what they do outside of Rubrique phalanx, but are pretty usable within, and particularly in a big squad of 10 with a Sorcerer attached. I've given them a 6.5 out of 10, though I'd put that significantly higher if they were in their chosen detachment. Next up for the Force of the Death Guard, we've got the Blightlord Terminators. These are their more standard Terminator equivalents, 115 points per 3, 185 per 5, or 370 for 10. As with the Death Guard being famed for their resilience, they have a massive great big toughness 7, so plenty of weapon profiles aren't going to be wounding them quite so well as they would other Terminators, and in the new incarnation of their rules in the Codex, they basically became a bit more of a hybrid shooting and melee unit, getting damage 2 on their melee attacks, and boosted shooting rules. They get a +1 strength and +1 AP when they're targeting afflicted units, which already are going to be having debuffs on them like -1 toughness and maybe worsening their saves as well. And it means that their plague combi bolters and array of big shooting weapons will hit the enemy really hard indeed. They seem like a good fit for the Lord of Virulence to command, re-rolling their firepower, and they do have some interesting synergies in a few of the detachments, Flyblown Host or the Deathlord's Chosen. I say at the moment they're actually not too bad a unit in terms of game balance. It's more that the Death Guard just have a bunch of things that are maybe just stand out crazy powerful, and particularly the Deathshroud Terminators, to the point where these guys are unlikely to get a look in. Overall at the moment I've given them a very Nurgle appropriate 7 out of 10. I feel like they've got some good interest, but are unlikely to be optimal or played all that much, while the strongest Death Guard units remain as powerful as they are. Speaking of which, 10th edition has been a very powerful one for the Deathshroud Terminators. They've basically had a good run of it for most of the way through, initially just being really cheap and dangerous for the points cost, and then in Codex Death Guard they went up in points cost, but also got some stat line boost and a fairly godly datasheet rule to compensate for that. The Deathshroud are the elite guard of Mortarion, and fighting with their rather iconic side Man Reapers. There are 140 points for the 3-man squad, or 300 for the 6, and they have an even more indomitable stat line versus the Blightlords, again being toughness 7, but also having 4 wounds, so not quite as easy to take out with damage 3 attacks. They've got a small amount of shooting from Placebert Gauntlets, have an aura of -1 leadership, and then their main event comes in melee with the Man Reapers, 4 attacks at strength 8, AP -2 and damage 2 with lethal hits, already nicely general purpose, though made even better by contagions. They hit on a 2+ as well, and it can sweep if you happen to be fighting against hordes. Their standout datasheet rule though is the Death Approaches one. When they're deep striking next to an afflicted unit, they can set up 6 inches away as opposed to 9 inches away as per normal. So if you can move some Poxwalkers to get afflicted on an enemy unit or something like that, then you're basically going to get a very short charge, and there's other ways to hand it out, such as in Mortarion's Hammer. It basically means that you can have some fantastically dangerous elites, usually led by a Lord of Contagion for the lance and the sustained hits, or just charge into the enemy unit of choice, and with their 6-inch deep strike range, if you can get contagions, then they're not very easy to screen out at all. The Lord of Contagion also chips in with his damage 3 attacks, which is good against Terminator equivalents and tough stuff, and can take some big enhancements. There's 2 good damage ones that they get on rather well with in the Virulent Vectorium. Being one of the strongest units and one of the strongest factions in the game, feels like they've got good arguments to being the game's best Terminators right now. I've given them a 9.5 out of 10. Finally, let's talk about the maybe near enough Terminators, as there are certain Xenos factions that basically do their own thing with exo armor as well. The Orky Meganobz weld together as much scrap as they can and power it with great big engines and pistons. The Orky Elites taking the biggest and nastiest fighting gear for themselves. And on the board, they cost 35 points each. You can fill them in squads of between 2 or 6, provided you don't take 4 of them. That means that they're fairly cheap for Terminator equivalents. They get 3 wounds at toughness 6 with a 2+ save. They don't get a 4+ invulnerable save or deep strike like the Space Marines. Then in melee, they have the choice between kill saws and power claws, or a mix of both. I feel like I've probably seen twin kill saw with 2 attacks at strength 12, AP 3 and damage 2 with twin links, maybe the single most commonly. So I've absolutely seen people take combinations of all the rest. It means they've got some at least fair enough danger against really tough stuff, but with so few attacks, they're not going to be quite as good against infantry. They'll really enjoy turns of the war though. They get +1 attack to make them far more general purpose in close combat, advance and charge to get them into battle, and they also get boosted to their 5+ feel no pain as well, making them really indomitable to take down. Currently, I say for the majority of Orky detachments, they're just a bit on the costly side really. As with quite a few Orky things, they only really make sense in certain ways. You're often seen with 2 of them accompanying Ghazghkull Thraka, as you need a lead squad to be able to access his big +1 to hit and wounds, so paying a small premium for the bodyguard for the boss could be well worth it. And they're a focal unit of the Bully Boys detachment, getting 2 turns worth of war, so 2 turns worth of that great feel no pain, and also having other nice support such as being able to teleport and rapid ingress a unit with a war boss enhancement and some stratagem support that can help them out with damage and defense. Overall though, I would say that their stat lines and particularly their damage output are a bit on the mid side for the points cost. I've given them a 6.5 out of 10. I would rate it higher either with Ghazghkull Thraka or in Bully Boys though. Finally, we've got the exo-armoured suits of the Einhyr Hearthguard for the Leagues of Votann. Looks harking back to the squat exo-armour of old, with their big shoulder pads and just a little bit of dwarven finery laid into those spacesuits. The kin are all very tough, but not quite as robust as the Space Marines or the Orcs. They're toughness 6 with a 2+ save. They don't get an invulnerable save and only get 2 wounds, making them a bit more susceptible to things like mass plasma fire, although their datasheet rule of a -1 to wound helps. They can use void armour as well, which can be pretty helpful if they're attacked by any one thing, though it is a little bit less powerful for them. Now it only applies against 1 unit's attacks, as opposed to an entire phase worth of attacks. For their weapons, they've got the choice between plasma guns at strength 8 and damage 2, or a bunch of spammed Vulcanite shots at range. They also get some grenade launchers with lots of copies of Blast to add to the mix, and it could be interesting enough jumping out of land fortresses. Rerolling wound rolls, particularly with the Vulcanite, is pretty punchy. And then in melee, they either get concussion gauntlets for 2 attacks at strength 9, AP 2 and damage 2. The Thane gets a hammer, or they could swap out for some plasma blades if you want to be better at killing lighter infantry. Like a bunch of the Leagues of Votann, they get significantly better if they're targeting judgment marked units. Potentially you could go for a great big 10-man squad, and they're quite efficient for the sustained hits 2 stratagem. They can deep strike, so it could be a rapid ingress thing, or as mentioned, small squads jumping in a land fortress. Given the points disparity, and they cost more for the big squad of 10, I've been seeing far more people playing them in units of 5 more recently. After the Void Armour nerf, they're maybe just a touch more take or leave than they used to be, some lists choosing to use them, some not. Overall, I've given them a 7 out of 10. They definitely have some good interest with some spam shooting and some alright melee, and potentially fairly punchy with an Einhyr champion added in. In any case, with the Xenos Terminator equivalents talked about, I'll leave that one there for now. Let me know your thoughts as to the Terminator squads of Warhammer 40k, which ones would you rate as stronger or weaker, and why. A big thank you to ObjectiveMarkers.com for sponsoring this one. Feel free to check out their site, links down in the video description below. They do have a bunch of fun stuff that could tie in well enough for a whole range of Warhammer 40k factions. In any case though, I'll leave that one there for now though. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, with new ones out just about every day. If you have been enjoying the videos on the channel, then check out the Patreon page as well. That's the main thing that supports video creation, and channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early and occasional votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link's down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.